What's up, y'all? It's Carla, aka Sila the Poet. Today, I am doing a clip to talk about in memory of Lesandro Jr. Guzman Feliz. So, in 2018, there was a young man that went by Junior, and he lived in the Bronx. And because of a case of mistaken identity, there were some members of the Trinitarios gang who mistook him for a rival gang member. They started a fight and ended up slashing this young teenager in the neck. And he ended up bleeding out and unfortunately passing away. And this happened, I believe, in front of a bodega. They started assaulting him or whatever. So, as a mother, because I am raising an Afro-Latino son, and when I, heard the news story about what happened to this young man, my heart was broken. Every now and then, I still think about Junior. I still think about what happened to him. I know that it has been quite a few years since it happened. But it also makes me think about the issues in the Latino community. So I grew up, being raised in an African American community, but every 2 weeks I would visit a Latino community where my grandparents lived, and in the Latino community, they had like some similar things going on, like in the African American community I was growing up in. They also had their gangs and they also had their violence. In the community where my father was at and where my grandparents, God rest their souls, lived at, they had Mexican gangs, they had, Latin kings over there. They had a couple of gangs in the area, and a lot of them would congregate in the park because my dad used to live in Sunset Park, Brooklyn. And so it just makes me think, like I said, Junior supposedly was a well-liked, well-loved young man who wanted to be a police officer, and I think he was headed that way. He was actually in a program, wanted to eventually be a cop. And just to have his life taken, so carelessly, so needlessly, it was just very, very hurtful to hear that as a mother. I think for any mother that lives in the barrio or lives in the hood, like I do, one of your worst nightmares is for your son. You send your son out or he goes out of the house and that he never returns home. And that's something that a lot of mothers that are raising sons in these neighborhoods that have violence in it and that have gangs in it have to worry about. So I know that Junior's mother, she lobbied for putting panic buttons in bodegas. I don't know if that ever came to pass, whether or not they ever passed a resolution for that to be done, but it would be nice if that could be done. And I know that a free camp was made in Junior's honor, to keep his memory alive. So most gangs, from what I read, they begin in the prison system. And the reason why, these gangs begin is usually so that the men can have safety from the rival gangs. And then it just makes me think about how our society and how our environment is so violent that, other men basically have to band together to protect each other from other violent men. It's like, a clusterfuck when you really think about it. It's just the nature of, some of these dudes out here. It's just like, what the hell? I just wish that before people go and they do violent things to people or they have no respect for human life, they need to think about how when you take someone else's life, or when you end the life of someone else's child, the parents that are left behind have to deal with empty bedroom. They have to deal with the unfair reality that you can never see your child again. They have a horrible reminder during birthdays and the death anniversary of their kid that they had to bury. You know, just the lost potential of the life, of the greatness that these kids could have had. They were robbed of it because their lives were stolen through violence or through gang violence. You know, these are things that, you know, I wish that people would think about. I wish that people would think about these things before making these horrible choices. So from what I understand, 5 gang members were put in jail for Junior's murder, even though, or should I say, Junior's unaliving. 5 gang members were doing time, but there were actually 14 people that were involved. 14, right? Because they thought that this young boy was a rival gang member, and he wasn't. It was a case of mistaken identity. And from what I understand, one of the main ringleaders was murdered in prison. So when you live by the sword, you basically eventually end up dying by the sword. If you live a life of violence, you expect that violence to not come back towards you. That's deep, you know, that, you know, people don't think about, you know, people would say karma, but I would say reaping and sowing. You reap what you sow. And so if you are violent toward other people, right, and you keep on engaging in violence, you don't think that that same violence is going to eventually come back to you and possibly end you, you know. So yeah, rest in peace to Lesandro Jr. Guzman Feliz. Like I said, you know, this happened years ago. He went downstairs to pay his friend back $5, and he was, you know, unfortunately unalived by gang members that, you know, was a case of mistaken identity. I will never forget, you know, that tragedy. And like I said, you know, as an Afro-Latino mother who's raising a son, you know, with that background, it is a fear of mine. And so we have to educate our kids. You know, we have to let kids know about the violence that is in our neighborhoods. We have to tell the kids about gangs and stuff like that. Unfortunately, we have to. You know, my son, the gangs in the neighborhood where I used to live at, they tried to recruit him twice. You know, I believe it was the Bloods. They tried to recruit my son twice. And once I found out, I started making a plan to move out of that neighborhood, because I just did not want my son to get caught up. And it's just a very realistic thing that, you know, when you live in a rough neighborhood, or you live in a hood, or you, like I said, you live in a barrio, and you have all of these groups and all of these gangs there, then these are things that you have to unfortunately face, you know, and these are realities that you have to deal with. You know, from what I understand, a lot of gangs, you know, like I said, they developed in the prison system, but even farther back, some of the gangs developed because of discrimination and racism. And because I know African American men, they couldn't get into country clubs, they couldn't get into certain places, they formed their own social organizations. And at first, you know, those organizations was about, you know, helping the community and being proud in your heritage and doing certain things. But over time, it morphed, unfortunately, into something else. It ended up going downhill, you know, and it's ended up turning into violence and fighting over turf, fighting over power, fighting over colors, disrespect and drugs and all of that. You know, the sale of guns, robberies. And I just think that, like I said, we're gonna have to come up with solutions on how to um, deal with, the gangs and the gang issues in our communities. You know, it's a reality that there are gonna be gangs, but if there's a way to improve situations or to make things better, then we have to try to find it. Okay, so like I said, this was just my thoughts on that young man, and every now and then, he crosses my mind. Rest in peace to Lesandro Jr. Guzman Feliz, okay? And that's all I have to say for now. Peace.